Good morning. How you doing this morning? Terrible. Oh. Terrible, living the dream. Go pray for terrible. I have a friend back in Chicago who, in a previous chapter of his life, worked for an organization known as the Memphis Syndicate. Now, if you're not familiar with the Memphis Syndicate, let's just say that it was a family business. And I'm not saying what kind of family, but my friend worked in their collections department. He was an accountant, so to speak, and he had been trained in a special accounting methodology where he specialized in breaking bones. So you can figure out what kind of family business this is. And so it was my friend's job to go visit customers and remind them that, their bill was a wee bit overdue, and just remind them of that in a friendly way. So he's actually a great guy. I wish he was here so you could see him. He's very big, very tall, very muscular, just a 24/7 poker face. You couldn't read this guy. And he attended a church I pastored in Chicago, and he was always whittling something with this just big, I don't know what kind of knife it was. It was scary looking. And, when somebody is whittling in Tennessee, right, you see them whittling, and the thought that crosses your mind is, well, oh, that's cool. What are you whittling, right? But when you see somebody whittling in Chicago, that's not what you think. The thought is, why do you have a big knife in your hand, right? It's different. The context completely changes your thoughts on whittling. So anyway, this was my accountant friend. And now imagine if you're a person that has an overdue bill with the Memphis Syndicate, and I can't pay this bill. There's no way I can get caught up on this. And this accountant friend shows up on your doorstep, walks up to you and says, hey, the boss sent me with a message for you. That was my best Memphis Syndicate. Kind of sounded like Rocky, huh? And by that I meant it sounded like I've been hit in the brain too many times. All right. He shows up and says, listen, my boss has a message for you. What are you going to do? What do you do if that actually happens to you? Well, you better pay pretty close attention. That's what you better do. You better listen pretty carefully and think very carefully about the message. And paying attention and listening carefully and thinking carefully here means more than just merely processing the words that are dripping into your ear and more than just turning it over in your brain. It means you need to do something. You need to make a new decision with your life based on the information. Right? Because the right answer the boss wants to hear is not when you say to the accountant friend, okay, I've heard your message, and let the boss know I'm really turning that over in my mind. Right? Is that what the boss wants to hear? No, he wants to know you're changing your life, or he's going to change your life a little bit for you. All right? Well, the punchline there, this opening illustration about the Memphis Syndicate is actually the bottom line application from our text this morning in Hebrews chapter 3 as we continue in our study through the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 3, we're sent a message. We're said, you better listen very carefully to a messenger who has come to you. You need to think carefully about this message. And by think carefully, I don't mean just let the words drip into your head and ruminate a little bit on it. By think carefully, it means you need to change the decisions you're making. You need to change the way you're living. Because if you don't listen to the Memphis Syndicate accountant who's come to encourage you to listen to the message, there's danger ahead if you don't listen. And that's exactly what we see in Hebrews 3 and throughout the book of Hebrews, really, that if we don't listen to the message, meaning change the way we're living our lives, there's danger ahead. So let's pick up in our text. It's Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, where we read these words. And so, dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those called to heaven, think carefully. There's a punchline in this passage. Think about it. Think carefully about this Jesus, whom we declare to be God's messenger and high priest. For he was faithful to God who appointed him, just as Moses served faithfully when he was entrusted with God's entire house. But Jesus deserves far more glory than Moses, just as a person who builds a house deserves more praise than the house itself. For every house is a builder, but the one who built everything is God. Now, Moses was certainly faithful in God's house as a servant. His work was an illustration of the truths God would reveal later. But Christ, as the Son, is in charge of God's entire house, and we are God's house if we keep our courage and remain confident in our hope in Christ. Like we've seen before in Hebrews, the thought of the author of Hebrews isn't necessarily very easy to track with, is it? You know, he's talking about, hey, I've got a message you got to listen very carefully to, and then all of a sudden he's going off on tangents about builders and Moses, and right? It's just like, okay, I'm not quite tracking with you. And so this is what I want you to see this morning is that the punchline of this passage is to communicate to you, it's to communicate to me why we need to think carefully about Jesus. Why we need to think carefully about Jesus. And secondly, it's going to drive home to us what it is that we need to think about Jesus. So why do we need to think carefully about Jesus and what it is we need to think about Jesus? And let me tell you just right here at the get-go why this is important to you. Why you need to think carefully about Jesus and these things that you need to think carefully about Jesus is because this is going to address fear and uncertainty and the lack of confidence that many of us experience in our relationship to the Lord. You know, just as you might imagine if my friend, the accountant, shows up at your doorstep and said, listen, I've got a message for the boss. You better get it together and make some new decisions in your life. And you might find yourself, living on, eggshells? Is that the expression? Pins and needles, both of them? You might find yourself living on pins and eggshells. There might be uncertainty. You might find yourself looking over your shoulder. Am I okay with the boss? And what we're going to see here in Hebrews chapter 3 is that the emphasis, the thrust of this passage is for you, Christian, who feel like you live your relationship with the Lord on pins and needles, on eggshells. You feel like you're constantly having to look over your shoulder because you're not sure if he's going to bust your kneecaps. This passage is for you to be assured, to be confident in your relationship with the Lord. But before we get out of that, we have to answer this question, why should I carefully consider Jesus? And he begins with the truth that, there is danger if we don't carefully consider Jesus. The warning, think carefully, here in chapter 3, verse 1, it echoes the warning we saw a couple weeks ago in chapter 2, verse 1, where we read these words. So we must listen carefully. This morning, think carefully. A couple weeks ago, listen carefully to the truth we have heard, or we may drift away from it. There's a danger in not thinking carefully. There's a danger in not listening carefully. There's a danger if we don't rearrange our lifestyles on the basis of the message that's been delivered to us by this messenger, and that danger is drifting away. Now, the author in this passage didn't define for us what it means to drift away, but it's not good. And we're going to see next week when we look at the danger of hardened hearts that the author is going to flesh out for us a little bit more of the danger that you and I face if we don't listen carefully to the messenger, if we don't make some new lifestyle decisions based on the message of the messenger. So, first of all, we need to think carefully about Jesus because there's danger in not doing so. But secondly, we need to think carefully about Jesus because whatever this danger is that we'll begin to unpack next week, whatever this danger is our danger. This danger is your danger. This danger is your danger. This danger is my danger. Look at who the author directs his warning to in Hebrews 3:1. He says, and so Dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those called to heaven, you guys need to think carefully about this Jesus. Who's in focus here? Brothers and sisters who belong to God, partners with those who are called to heaven. The warning here, the danger here is not for some poor slobs outside the walls. The author of Hebrews is addressing people inside these walls right here, brothers and sisters who belong to God. That's why we need to listen very carefully, because this warning is for us. The danger is for us. So that's why we need to carefully consider Jesus. There's danger in not doing so, and the danger, whatever that is ours. So that's why we need to carefully consider Jesus. What is it that we need to think about Jesus then, if the danger of not thinking carefully is real and the danger is mine? Well, in verses 1 through 6, we're going to see that there are 5 truths about who Jesus is that we need to carefully fix in our minds, that we need to build our life upon. Truths about Jesus that ought determine the choices that we're going to make in life. More than just hearing truths, more than truths just to turn over in our brains, but truths about Jesus that ought dictate the choices we're going to make in life. So what should we think about Jesus? First of all, verse 1 tells us that in order to avoid the danger of spiritual drift, in order to avoid the danger of hardened hearts, we need to carefully consider that Jesus is the voice of God. Jesus is the voice of God. That's the first blank in your notes this morning if you're following along there. Verse 1 says, we need to think carefully about this Jesus, whom we declare to be God's messenger. Now, the word messenger here is the same word from where we get the English word apostle. It says that Jesus is God's apostle. Jesus is God's messenger. And an apostle is one who is officially authorized and commissioned to speak on behalf of the one represented. So Jesus is the official designee, the official person commissioned to speak for God. Right, in my opening illustration about the accountant friend from the Memphis Syndicate, he was officially commissioned to speak on behalf of the boss, right? And so when he told you need to pay your bill, or I'm going to remind you of how important it is, you paid attention. You'd pay attention, right? Because he's officially commissioned to speak for the boss. Well, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1 is telling us that Jesus is God's messenger. He's officially commissioned. In other words, what you hear Jesus say, God said. When you hear the voice of Jesus, you've heard the voice of God. That's the implication. We need to listen to Jesus, because when we listen to Jesus, we've listened to the voice of God. Now, that's a pretty rudimentary truth, right? We've all known that. We've all believed that probably since we were kids. The words of Jesus are the words of God. So our danger, church, is not in not knowing that Jesus is God's message. We've got that, God's messenger, right? We've got that down, right? We've got that down. We get that. Our danger, rather, is in not listening carefully to the words of Jesus as the words of God. Our danger is not listening to the voice of Jesus as the voice of God. Our danger is in not paying attention. Our danger is in not rearranging our lives and making new kinds of decisions because we believe that the voice of Jesus is the voice of God. So think of my accountant friend once again. When he shows up and says to you, hey, listen, the boss has a message for you and you better pay attention. What he's not looking for from you is to say, okay, listen, I'm hearing you. Go back and tell your boss that I believe you're the official messenger. Just tell him that. He'll be good. Is he going to be good with that? The boss is going to say, he said what? No. I don't care what he believes. I want to see some change in his life. Right? Well, it's the same truth here. It's not enough for us to just give intellectual assent to the fact that the words of Jesus are the words of God. This passage is saying, no, there needs to be change based on that. It needs to be changed. We need to make some new life decisions, take some new life directions that result from the message of the messenger from the boss. I believe that one of the most serious dangers facing us in the church, in this church, in the church in America, is that we don't know the voice of God simply because we don't know the words of Jesus. We don't know the voice of God simply because we're not listening to the words of Jesus. We're becoming more and more biblically illiterate in the Christian church in the United States. We're, to switch metaphors, we're like spiritual anorexics. We're spiritually malnourished simply because we're not ingesting the Word of God with any regularity. And spiritual malnourishment is a tragedy because there's a very simple solution. Eat this book. Just take daily portions of this book. You don't need to be malnourished, church. You don't need to walk in an absence of knowing what the words of God are because we've got the words of Jesus right here. And so here's a simple solution, simple antidote to spiritual anorexia, if I'm describing you, is just eat some of the words of Jesus every day. Just open up to the Gospels. If you have a New Testament, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Just read a chapter every day. It's an antidote to spiritual anorexia. But perhaps, and I'm going to tease out this analogy a little bit further, perhaps an equally serious danger facing us beyond spiritual anorexia is spiritual bulimia. And that means this: even though many of us give intellectual assent to the fact that the words of Jesus are the words of God, we still sometimes find ourselves spitting back out some of the words of Jesus because we just don't like the way they taste. We vomit them back up. Oh, I know Jesus said it, I just don't like it, so I'm not going to do it. Do you know that one? We're spiritually malnourished because we're spiritually bulimic. Some of us, there's two different ways we might be spiritually bulimic. Some of us are in danger because we purge the words of Jesus we don't like. Jesus' harsh words. Jesus had some tough things to say, right? He had some inconvenient truths. Jesus had some exclusive words. Bless those who persecute you. I don't like that one. Forgive those who have sinned against you. That tastes bad. I'm not going to do that one, right? If someone takes advantage of you, if they steal from you, if they take your coat, give them your shirt too. No, I don't like the taste of that one, right? Hey, listen, don't judge your neighbor. Don't get so upset about the speck in your neighbor's eye. Deal with the crud in your own eye, you hypocrite. Ooh, that's kind of a spicy thing Jesus served up. I don't like that. All right? Some of us are malnourished because we can't believe that the strong taste of some of Jesus' words has any nutritional value for us, so we spit it back up. We're in danger of picking and choosing which parts of the boss's message we're going to listen to, we're going to ignore. And if that's the way we're living our lives, we're in danger. We're in danger of hardened hearts. We're going to look at that next week. But many of us face a little bit different version of bulimia. Now listen to this carefully. Some of us have the most difficult time holding down Jesus' kind words. Some of us swallow the hard things Jesus says to us. It's the kind things, it's the nice things, it's the gracious things, it's the loving things that he speaks to you that you might find, I can't hold that down, I can't believe that, I can't trust it. And so we bring that one back up. You know what I'm talking about? Jesus said, listen, it's finished. Your sins are forgiven. It's done. I don't know if I can trust that. I love you, Jesus says. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I can't believe that the sweet taste of those Jesus' words are meant for me. And so we purge those words. Some of you understand what I'm talking about. You just can't believe it. And so we're malnourished because we can't believe the good things. Jesus said, imagine if my accountant friend showed up at your house and said, listen, the boss has a message for you. And this is it. Your debt is forgiven. Didn't see that one coming. My debt is forgiven. Now imagine if instead of living a life of freedom in the messenger's truth, you chose to continue to live in fear. You don't believe it. Say, no, break my pinky. Whack my kneecap with a baseball bat. What a tragedy it is that we don't trust the messenger's good message. And in the same way, it's a tragedy that many Christians live their lives disbelieving Jesus' good news. And instead of living a life of freedom in God's love and God's grace, God's forgiveness and God's acceptance and in God's friendship, we mistakenly live this relationship with God where we need Him to bust our pinkies and bust our kneecaps. This passage is written to give you an assurance of a friendship with God, of a forgiveness, of a truth that is yours in Jesus Christ. So very quickly, just to apply this first point, if you can identify with this thought, I just don't feel like I ever hear the voice of God. If you can identify with being spiritually malnourished because you're never ingesting the words of Christ, or maybe spiritually malnourished because you're spitting out Jesus' hard words, or you're spiritually malnourished because you're spitting out Jesus' kind words. Eat the book. Eat the book. That's the antidote to spiritual malnourishment. Eat the book. Think carefully about the message of the messenger, God's messenger. All right, that's point one. Jesus is God's voice. Point two, Jesus is God's hand. Jesus is God's hand. Verse 1 tells us that in order to avoid this danger of spiritual drift, in order to avoid the danger of hardened hearts, we need to consider carefully, think carefully, and build our life around the truth that Jesus is God's hands. We see that also in verse 1 where we're told, think carefully about this Jesus whom we declare to be God's high priest. Now, this theme of Jesus as God's high priest was introduced to us last week at the end of chapter 2. It's reintroduced here in chapter 3. We're going to see it revisited in 4 and 5. And the author's just kind of teasing us because he's not really giving us a whole lot of explanation of what this means that Jesus is our high priest. And it's not until we get to chapters 8, 9, and 10 that, he backs up the dump truck and it's like, boo. So we're going to deal with it when we get to chapters 8, 9, and 10. So this morning I only want to mention in passing what the author is mentioning in passing here is that we need to listen carefully to Jesus because he's our high priest. We need to listen to him because he's the messenger of God, but also because he's the hand of God as our high priest. Now think of it this way, going back to my accountant friend. In the same way that my accountant friend was a go-between between an offended boss, an offended creator, and a guilty debtor, so too was it the job of the high priest to act as a between God and mankind. Between an offended God who is holy and righteous and just and pure and sinless. And the high priest function as a go-between between God and then guilty, sinful man. Right? That was the duty of the high priest. And the high priest performed ritual duties and sacrifices that served to bridge the gap between the sinless, perfect, offended God and the guilty human being. All right? And in some sense, the high priest, maybe to connect it to our analogy, he bridged that gap by busting up some kneecaps, offering sacrifices, busting some pinkies. Right? That's what's happening in temple sacrifice. Somebody's paying the penalty that you owed as an individual. Does that make sense? All right, that's what we're going to get to in chapters 8, 9, and 10. But the high priest served as a go-between to create a friendship between a God who was offended by our sin and our failure to obey God. The high priest is a go-between to bridge the gap. Now, I think that if most of us were honest, we're aware that there's a gap between who we are and who God is. Yeah? Can you identify? I mean, we know that. I think most people are keenly aware that there are things that we've said in life, there are things that we've thought in life that, it's embarrassing, it's shameful. It's maybe wicked before, certainly things that are wicked before a perfect God. And we know, I shouldn't have done that. And we're keenly aware that there's this gap. I think most of us are aware that there are things that we've done. I think most of us are aware there are things that we haven't done that we should have done that create this huge gap between who we are and who God is. And so we feel that distance, and we know we're unable to look God in the eyes, and we know we need some sort of go-between. Not a kneecap-busting go-between who's going to make us pay for the gap, but we need an offense-removing go-between. We need somebody to bridge that gap for us. Now, in the absence of that person bridging the gap for us, in the absence of having a go-between, in the absence of having a high priest, there's a lot of different kind of choices that you and I make to try to bridge that gap. Some of us try to work harder. We try harder. We try to do it better. You know what I'm talking about? I'm just going to do it better, God. I'm sorry. I am going to close the gap just because next time, just give me another chance. I'm going to pay my debt. Some of us deal with that gap just by giving up. I can't do it, and I'm sick of trying. So forget you, God. Come get me. Right? There's a couple different ways of dealing with the gap. Some of us try to bridge the gap by just ignoring that it's there, by rebelling against it. When we feel that distance, when we feel the guilt, some of us just anesthetize the guilt. Instead of trying to bridge the gap, we just anesthetize the guilt. We try to sear our consciences so we're not aware of that gap existing. Some of us try to close that distance between us and God by trying to drag God to our level. Well, he's a jerk in some way, right? There's a lot of different ways we try to bridge the gap that we know in our hearts exist between who we are and who God is. But all of these various attempts all have one thing in common, and that's this, that there's an awareness that the gap exists. Right? Does that make sense? Everybody you know who's trying in one way or another to bridge that gap is giving assent to the truth that the gap exists. The gap is really there. There's a gap that exists between each individual human being and God, and it's a problem that needs to be dealt with. Well, the book of Hebrews tells us that the gap has been dealt with. It's been dealt with once and for all. We're going to see in a couple chapters in Jesus Christ as the high priest. He's our go-between, not a kneecap-busting go-between, but a go-between who extends for us a hand of forgiveness, who extends for us a hand of friendship from the Heavenly Father to us. Let's again revisit my accountant friend for the Memphis Syndicate. Imagine he shows up at your house and says, listen, I got a message for you from the boss. And he's got a baseball bat in his hand. It's got your name on it. And he's kind of doing one of these numbers. He takes out the baseball bat, he lays it on the ground and says to you, your debt is forgiven. I'll skip the Rocky thing. I'm kind of embarrassed by it. Your debt is forgiven. I personally took the beating for you. I got my kneecaps busted up for you. I got my pinkies broken for you. And now your debt is paid in full. And now I offer you this message from the boss. Friends, a hand of friendship, a hand of reconciliation, a hand of forgiveness. What are you going to do? Take that deal. That's what you do. You take the deal. You'd listen carefully to that deal. You'd make some new life decisions based on that deal. And that's exactly what Hebrews 3 is telling us about Jesus as our high priest. He's our go-between. He's the hand of God. We need to listen carefully to Jesus. We need to get it into our hearts, not just our brains, but our hearts, that Jesus is the voice of God who's delivering some hard truths that we need to listen to. He's delivering some kind truths that we need to listen to, but he's also delivering the hand of God, a hand of forgiveness and a hand of friendship, a hand of reconciliation with him. We need to trust that. We need to trust that Jesus, we need to listen carefully because he's the hand of God. Point 3, Jesus is also God's assurance. He's God's voice, he's God's hand, he's God's assurance. Now, if my accountant friend shows up at your doorstep and says, hey, listen, your debt is forgiven, the boss wants to be friends with you, probably most of us would say, this is too good to be true. Can I trust you? I mean, did the boss really say this to you? Does he know we're having this conversation? He's okay with this? I mean, is it really true that my debt is retired and my friendship is secured? Like forever? Or am I going to wake up tomorrow and find out this was just a cruel joke and it's taken away from me? Is he going to change his mind next week? Wouldn't you feel that way? It's like, I'm not sure I can trust this. Well, verses 2 through 4 address this doubt, this insecurity, this question we may have. Can we trust Jesus' hand of friendship? Can we trust Jesus' words of forgiveness and reconciliation? These verses address, the question in our heart. Jesus, is this message from the boss, is it really for me? Does God the Father really know you made this deal? Or is this going to go away? Is my sin really, my debt of sin, is it really retired forever and always? Is my friendship with the Heavenly Father, is it really secured forever and always? Can I trust this message? Well, verse 2 answers yes. Yes, absolutely. Jesus is God's assurance. Verse 2 says, for he was faithful to God. Jesus the messenger was faithful to God who appointed him. God appointed him. Jesus didn't just make this up on his own. He wasn't going rogue on the Heavenly Father. It says the Father appointed him. And then goes on to say, just as Moses served faithfully when he was entrusted with God's entire house. So if you underline the words faithful to God who appointed him, what we see here is Jesus was an appointee, meaning God chose him to be this messenger of forgiveness, this messenger of friendship with God. So Jesus was an appointee. But then Jesus was also a faithful appointee, which means he's going to do the job that he was given to do. He's going to be faithful. He's going to be relentless in his pursuit of applying to you the friendship of God. He's going to be relentless in applying to you the forgiveness of the Father. Now let's go back to my accountant friend for the Memphis Syndicate. Let's say he shows up at your door, gives you this message. The boss says your debt's forgiven. We're friends. And you don't believe it. It's like, I don't buy it. And he shows up the next day, pulls out the baseball bat, again, puts it down on the ground, says, listen, I took the beating for you. Debt's paid. Your sins are, debt's paid. You're friends with the boss. The next day he shows back up. Bats goes down. Right? He's a faithful appointee. He's a messenger from the boss, and he's driving home with you relentlessly the truths of grace, the truths of mercy. And that's exactly who Jesus is, as a faithful appointee. He's speaking on the authority of the Father. He didn't make it up. He didn't go rogue. God commissioned him to speak grace to you. He commissioned him to speak forgiveness to you. He commissioned him to speak friendship to you. And he's going to do it and do it again and again and again as a faithful appointee, until it begins to sink into our hearts. But we just need to listen very carefully. And that means just trust the truth that that hand of friendship is for real. Those words of grace are for real. Jesus is the faithful appointee, and that's why we need to listen to him. Point 4. Jesus is God himself. Again, this is an elementary truth we all know already, but let's see how the author of Hebrews is using it to further secure our confidence in the Christian life. Verses 3 and 4 tell us that we need to listen carefully to Jesus because Jesus is God himself. All right, verses 3 and 4, it's a complicated passage. We're going to unpack it. But Jesus deserves far more glory than Moses, just as a person who builds a house deserves more praise than the house itself. For every house has a builder, but the one who built everything is God. Okay, it sounds like a tangent. Let's admit it. Doesn't it sound like a tangent? Nobody wants to admit it. I see a couple nods out there. Yeah, it's like, what in the world? And certainly, where do we get the question that this is Jesus is God himself? Well, here's the logic here. See, the readers of Hebrews trusted Moses. Right? They trusted Moses. They trusted Moses as God's messenger, who in some sense built the priestly system. We've been talking about the high priest. The high priest served as a go-between. The high priest served as the one who offered sacrifices that secured for the people, at least temporarily, friendship with God and forgiveness of their sins. And if you're reading the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, I don't know why I put the emphasis there, Deuteronomy. When you read through those books, you see that Moses was in some sense the builder of this place of forgiveness with God. He was the builder of this place of friendship with God. And the readers of Hebrews, they trusted Moses. But the author is then saying, listen, Moses was a faithful contractor, but he didn't design the building. Moses wasn't the architect of forgiveness with God. Moses wasn't the architect of friendship with God. He merely built the place. He merely built a shelter of forgiveness and friendship with God. But the architect was God himself. All right, you see that at the very end? The one who built everything is God. All right, now, if we go back to the very beginning, whole logic. All right, so the builder, Moses, is worthy of more honor than the building, right? Builder, worthy of more honor than the building. Architect is worthy of more honor than the builder, right? And God, who is the architect, is worthy of more honor, than all of them, right? And so and Jesus deserves far more glory than Moses. Moses was what? The builder. And who's worthy of more honor than the builder? The architect. And who's the architect? God. And so Jesus is God. That's the logic of this verse. It's kind of an obtuse way to get there, but the readers of Hebrews got it. He's saying Jesus is God himself. Jesus is the architect of forgiveness. He's the architect. He's the one who conceived of forgiveness and friendship with God. You guys trust Moses. You trust that if you do the right deals, you're going to be, you do the right things. You avoid doing the wrong things. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay with the Father. But I'm telling you that Jesus conceived of this place of forgiveness and friendship with the Father. He's far more trustworthy than Moses. Maybe here's another way to think about this truth. So my accountant friend shows up at your doorstep, and he says to you again, I've got a message from the boss. And the message is a message of forgiveness. It's a message of friendship with the boss. And when you press the messenger for assurance, he explains to you, listen, I'm an official messenger. I'm speaking to you the words of the boss. Trust me. I'm a faithful appointee. But when you said, listen, I need some sort of assurance from the boss himself, because I'm not sure I can trust you even as a faithful appointee. The accountant friend then explains, all right, well, this is what you need to know. I am the boss. Does that change it? Does that change your ability to trust his offer of friendship, his offer of forgiveness? You realize he's not just a go-between. There's no person in between us. I am face to face with the boss. That's the truth of who Jesus is for us that's being explained to us in verses 3 and 4. He's not just a go-between. He's the architect. He's not somebody who's gone rogue, introducing friendship and forgiveness into something that the boss never wanted. He is the boss. And so that means you can be assured that Jesus' desire for you is friendship with the Father, forgiveness before the Father. Do you see how that works? He is the architect. He is God. He is the boss. All right, so that's the fourth point. Fifth point then really ties into that. It tells us that in order to avoid the dangers that are before us, we need to carefully consider that Jesus then is also Lord. He is also Lord. And the thrust of these verses is the same as the previous two, to underscore our confidence and our assurance in the message and the ministry of Jesus. But in these final two verses, Jesus' authority is elevated even higher than being that of a mere messenger. Jesus' authority is elevated being even higher than just being a mere go-between, as a mere priest. And it's elevated even higher than Jesus being the boss himself. What's higher than all those? How can the author of Hebrews be pointing to Jesus who's elevated even higher than all of those things? It says this is the highest level that he's elevated to. He's a son. He's not just a messenger. He's not just a servant. He's speaking to us with the authority of a son, the authority of family. Now, in a family business, family is important. In a family business, family is important. Well, let's look at the verses. Now, Moses was certainly faithful in God's house as a servant. You trust Moses. He's just a servant. His work was an illustration of the truths God would reveal later. But Christ, as the Son, not just a servant, but as the Son, he's in charge of God's entire house, and we are God's house. And so the readers trusted Moses as a builder of the house of forgiveness and friendship, but Jesus is the architect we just saw of forgiveness and friendship. The readers trusted Moses as a servant in the house of forgiveness and friendship, but Jesus is the Son. He's family in a family business. And as the Son, he's in charge of the house of forgiveness and friendship. And so his assurance of God's forgiveness over your life and his assurance as God's friendship to you is the authority of a son. It's spoken on the authority of a son. Now, once again, think about this. If my accountant friend showed up at your doorstep, said, I got a message for the boss, your debt is forgiven, you're friends with the boss, and you needed some assurances. How do I know you're speaking for the boss? How do I know you haven't gone rogue? And he says, listen, I'm an official messenger. It's not enough. I need more. Well, I am the boss, all right? Our assurance level is going up, right? But you might find yourself thinking, well, you're the boss? You're the boss of the family business? Are you family, though? Because if you're not family, the family might come back and like off you, and then where am I with your debt forgiveness? You see how we can't quite be secure if the person who's giving us some assurance isn't family. But if the messenger says, listen, I am the boss and I am family. I am the family. I'm the son. I'm in charge of the organization. And that puts to death our final fear, our final lack of confidence in the message and the hand of friendship. This is the family who has said, your friends, you're in. Your family too. And that can change the way we live our lives if we listen carefully and believe who Jesus has said he is for us. And when we don't believe, when we doubt his forgiveness, when we doubt the hand of friendship, we live a Christian life of looking over our shoulders, waiting for the baseball bat to come cracking down on our kneecaps. For God to come snapping our pinkies. Because we've believed something other than the message of the messenger who has offered to us words of forgiveness and a handshake of friendship. So listen carefully to Jesus. There's danger in not believing what Jesus has said. Trust Jesus. Make new life changes, new life directions on the basis of who Jesus is. That's why we need to think carefully about him. Let's stand.